Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. Before we get started, I want to mention, as predicted, Sheffield Wednesday beat Chesterfield. I met John Pearson. He was so impressed with my prognosticating abilities, he gave me his tie. That's right. Stacy Herbert.
Max, well, you may have been too busy at the Sheffield Wednesday game to have noticed that Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy have been photographed standing together. And you know what that means? That means another cunning plan. Only this one, Chancellor Merkel announced, "We are not going into the details today. The whole package will be ready by the end of the month."
There are no details other than desperate money printing as the banking system implodes. At least those Occupy Wall Street people have finally figured out one thing. It's not the government that's the problem, but the banks. Recurring theme, I'm sure, but tell us more.
Well, I maintain there is no difference between banks and government. They are the same thing. But let's move on to covering this Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy meeting. The incredible dog and pony show, Merkel and Sarkozy. So this is our guest from last week, Charles Hugh Smith, and he said that every time the ugly truth of systemic insolvency rears its frightening head once again, out comes the Sarkozy-Merkel dog and pony show in order to do exactly as the Fed says in their handbook, is manage perception. They don't need to have a plan, they just need to manage perception.
Well, in a fiat currency world, all you need to do is manage perception because you're managing consumers. The people who 70% of the US economy are trigger-happy, drug-addled consumaholics who are wed to their food stamp card and their credit card and debit cards. You just manage perceptions. If you just get them to go into a frothy frenzy based on a pack of lies, which was what Sarkozy and Merkel, that's all they can talk about, that's how you manage the economy. Because there's no underlying base foundation for the economy. It's all based on fluff.
Yeah, but that worked for the past 30-something years since the U.S. went off the gold standard and the world turned to fiat currencies en masse. But as Charles Hugh Smith says here, the problems of the global economy are not based in perception, but in the reality of prices, balance sheets, and income statements, vast concentrations of wealth and power, precarious systemic imbalances, ruthless exploitation, and command economies mismanaged by central bank policy and manipulation. So we're at that end game of managed perception. It worked for quite a few decades.
Sure, we're at the end game, but the question is how long they can extend this end game using computer trading, algorithmic trading, where they effectively seize the price discovery mechanism. They make the prices. They've got infinite credit. They're disenfranchising and stealing hundreds of billions of dollars every month, and it goes on and on. The Occupy Wall Street crowd is growing in size. The global insurrection against banker occupation, savers versus speculators, we called it years ago. It's finally getting a foothold. It's working its way into the mainstream media. Where will it end? Well, it ends when they take the ability to create prices out of computer algorithmic trading is taken away. That's when it ends.
Well, you talk about this Occupy Wall Street, and of course they're operating against the bankers as bankers versus the people, the 1% versus the 99%. But here's another takeaway headline from the Merkel-Sarkozy meeting. Merkel, Euro leaders will do all necessary to support banks. They will not support the populations. They will continue to support the banks. They have not learned any lesson. This is what they are saying. European leaders are coming under increasing pressure from international counterparts to end the debt contagion that President Barack Obama said last month was scaring the world.
It's scaring the bankers.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not scaring the world. The world is becoming empowered by their efforts to decapitalize and get rid of these bankers. They're not scared. The bankers are scared.
Yeah, exactly. And why do they have Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, have to state these facts? The bankers are afraid mostly of the German population because they know that the German population is the one with all of the cash and the savings. And that's what they want to bail them out. So it's up to Merkel to manage the perceptions of the German population.
Right, and any leader who defends the interest of the banks is clearly got the interest of the people running a second place in that equation. So, I mean, she's not doing great in elections, and hopefully she'll get bounced out.
Well, you know, the previous announcement Merkel and Sarkozy made was the EFSF, the European Financial Stability SIC, is that how you pronounce that? SIC. It's not financial stability, but they call it that anyway. So let's look at this headline, Max. Greece activates rescue fund to save Proton Bank. Yes, the first bank bailed out by the EFSF. Greece's central bank said on Monday it activated a bank rescue fund to save Proton Bank, effectively nationalizing the small lender that is under investigation for possible violation of the country's money laundering laws.
What they need is a neutrino bank that allows them to go faster than light, go backwards in time, and undo this mess before it even starts.
Well, but it's so symbolic that the very first bank rescued by the EFSF is engaged in money laundering out and out. Why are we rescuing a bank that is engaged in money laundering just like we rescued Wachovia? Why not just let these drug dealers and money launderers go out of business?
Because they don't believe in competition. They don't believe in competition. I'm all for free market competition, but the operative word there is competition. If you've got draconian rent-seeking banking kleptocrats fudging up the works with their algorithmic trading and outright larceny, you don't have competition, do you?
No.
I'm for competition. Let's see some competition.
Just like the Wednesday versus Chesterfield.
Like everyone should emulate Sheffield Wednesday Football Club. They're on a winning streak because they return to their roots as world-class competitors. They're heading toward the premiership.
Okay, so let's move to this next headline. Another bailout, another breakup, another toxic bank across Europe. Dexia board meets as France, Belgium tussle over troubled assets. So, you know, Belgium has bailed out the Belgian arm of Dexia, which is now threatening a downgrade of Belgium. So again, throwing the population, throwing an entire nation, the existence and credit of a nation to save a group of bankers. But I want to quote from this headline from Bloomberg, just the managing perception angle of this. Rescuing Dexia, the first victim of the debt crisis at the core of Europe, has become critical to preventing contagion in the region's banking industry. Again, the managing perception, rescuing Dexia is absolutely necessary for the survival of human beings.
Right, all the Lehman Brothers collapse and the Bear Stearns collapse, or they got the rescue. We now know that that would have been better off had they allowed the bad banks to go bust, and they were more attentive to the needs of the underlying competitive economy. But now Europe is making the exact same mistakes, rescuing Dexia at the expense of their competitive economy.
Well, Max, Bloomberg goes on to say, Dexia's balance sheet, with total assets of about 518 billion euros at the end of June, is about the size of the entire banking system in Greece and larger than the combined assets of financial institutions bailed out in Ireland in the last 2.5 years. It's also, remember, Dexia was the #1 recipient of Federal Reserve funds from the U.S. Federal Reserve. They were keeping it afloat in 2008.
Well, folks, I got to hip you about a little legerdemain of grammar and syntax and word usage. The word assets, in this case, refers to debt. So whenever you see in the paper, Dexia's got $118 billion in assets, no, it's assets for the bankers because it's debt that they're collecting rent from you in the form of austerity measures. But it's not an asset in the sense that it's worth anything. It's debt pulled out of their schwing that has an interest-bearing coupon that you've got to pay for through austerity measures. Yes, it's an asset for them, but it's a pain in the for you.
Now, the reason why the U.S. Federal Reserve was propping up Dexia for so long is that Dexia is crucial, they say, to the municipal bond market. So it holds the assets of many municipal bonds, including New York City, on its books.
Look, the pirates off the Somali coast are critical for the economy of Somalia. That's true. If you remove the pirates, the economy in Somalia would collapse. That's true. In the same way that Dexia is crucial to the European banking system. That's true. But it doesn't mitigate the fact that they are freaking pirates.
Well, Qatar is rumored to be picking up the best assets for at fire sale prices.
Oh yeah, Qatar, right. Of course, Qatar is going to be picking up assets. Hey, where's that other freaking Saudi guy, Ali Walid? He's always picking things at the absolute top. He's the worst stockbroker that ever lived.
No, but this is what's happening we've seen throughout the European crisis, is real assets, the real, genuine, good quality assets get handed at fire sale prices to insiders, to the elite. The bad assets, which are not actually assets, but debts that will never be paid back, and so therefore are just black holes of nothingness, they get handed to the taxpayer. So it's confusing. Like you said, the word assets is a confusing term.
Right, and at the same time, they vilify the word commodities.
Yeah.
Commodities are worthless. Meanwhile, they're taking the assets that is nothing but debt to buy the good stuff that they think stinks.
So again, fighting this banker occupation is Occupy Wall Street. So I want to turn to this next headline, Max. John Hussman, there are 4 things that every Wall Street protester should know. So this is a newsletter writer, John Hussman of Hussman Funds. And the 4 points he says that all Occupy Wall Street protesters should know when they speak to the media is 1, failure means bondholders shouldn't be guaranteed every penny. And he's in fact referring to the managed perception that somehow banks are too big to fail, that if they fail, you 99%, we are crucial to your existence. And he said that's fake, because depositors are protected when a bank fails. It's the bondholders and stockholders who lose.
Yeah, okay, what else does he say?
The Federal Reserve's purchases of Fannie and Freddie were illegal. Number 3, creating shell companies like Maiden Lane to buy bad Wall Street assets was illegal. And 4, policies of bailouts only misallocate capital and exacerbate the wealth skew.
What do you think of those 4 demands? I mean, in my opinion, it doesn't get at the nettle of the problem. Clearly, the one thing that these protesters want is higher interest rates, and that should be what their rallying cry is. We want higher interest rates, which would bankrupt the speculators and give us, the savers, greater return on our jobs, on our savings. That should be the rallying
Well,
cry.
that's kind of what he's saying in the 4th point. The policies of bailouts only misallocate capital. So he goes on to write in his own letter, despite inflicting massive damage on the economy, too big to fails are afforded a protected status that allows them to extract rents that don't reflect the cost they have imposed. From that standpoint, the Occupy Wall Street protests are a welcome reflection of public frustration over Washington's slavish coddling of reckless financial institutions.
Sure. Great points. But again, you need a single rallying cry to win against the speculators. There has to be economies of scale. There has to be a certain oneness of purpose to defeat the speculators. And so far, they're getting a huge base, but there is no rallying cry. Okay, fine. The base is continuing to grow, which is useful. But there is no single rallying cry yet, and I believe that this is where they're going. They will eventually figure this out, and they will figure out that their mass global protest can, in effect, put risk back onto the balance sheets of these banks where it came from, and decapitalize the banks. You want to get rid of the cancer. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Much more coming your way right after this.
Observe nature and discover its beauty. Communicate with the wild and learn. Test yourself and become free. See what nature can give you on RT.
Welcome to the future, bringing you the latest in science and technology from around Russia.
We've got the future covered.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Los Angeles and speak with Ellen Brown, author of Web of Debt. Ellen Brown, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max. Always a pleasure.
All right. Ellen Brown, European banks are being nationalized left and right as the ongoing global financial crisis continues to wreak havoc. So what were once private banks are now becoming publicly owned banks. But we already have a model of publicly owned banks. How do these two compare?
Well, Germany, for example, half their commercial loans are through publicly owned banks. They probably have the strongest European tradition of publicly owned banks, but they're being attacked by the private banks. So the legs are being taken out from under them in the form of government guarantees. But say in Japan, their banks were nationalized in the 90s. And then as nationalized banks, they had to do things for the public. In other words, they were used as public utilities, which is a good thing. In fact, the reason Japan could carry a debt to GDP ratio of 224%, which is the highest of any of the major countries, is that their debt is actually owned by their own banks. So it's internal debt. It's not debt owed to foreign creditors who can squeeze them, raise the rates, etc.
Now, going back to Germany for a second, Landesbanks, this is a big system there. So describe Landesbanks in Germany.
The Landesbanks are public banks that have been around for 200 years. It's a very solid tradition in Germany. It is how they funded their small and medium-sized businesses, which are the businesses that were responsible for their very strong export business in the second half of the 20th century. They were the leader in exports, and they're a relatively small country, like they're half the size of Texas, and here they were global leader in exports. Well, these are their small and medium-sized businesses, which the Landesbanks, the public banks, supported. And underneath the Landesbanks are the head of this whole pyramid of local public banks, which are called Sparkassen. And they're all geared towards serving the public interest and basically serving the local businesses. So where our banks are not lending to local businesses, particularly the big Wall Street banks that have all the excess reserves on their books, in Germany, that's their mandate, to serve their local business.
All right, let's go back to 2008 for a second here. Of course, the Landesbanks in Germany were some of the first banks, or the first banks actually, to get the big bailout from Wall Street, from the U.S. So how does that play into the story?
Well, the reason they had to get into speculative derivatives, et cetera, at all was that in 2001, they were no longer allowed to, the EU rules no longer allowed them to count their government guarantees as part of their capital. And they had to compete with the other banks to turn a profit for their shareholders, where the shareholders are the public, the local governments, who didn't really want the profits, but that was the rule imposed supposedly to make them competitive with the private banks. But that's the whole point of being a public bank, that you've got the guarantee, you've got the public behind you. And so you can make lower interest loans, you can make longer term loans, you don't always have to be looking at your quarterly profits for your shareholders. So they're forcing them to fit into the private bank mold, which naturally they then got into trouble. But as long as they were allowed to do the public bank thing, they were highly successful.
Okay, so and presumably the Landesbanks were caught up in buying derivatives from Wall Street that the rating agencies had rated AAA. So they were unaware that the rating agencies were corrupt and applying these ratings as part of a quid pro quo scam of underhanded dealings and kickbacks. So the American public ended up bailing out German banks, again, to pay for the fraud at Moody's, Fitch, and S&P. So let me ask you something. We see over and over again across the U.S., U.K., and Europe, governments use their authority and power to transfer state funds to cronies, for example, within the military-industrial complex. Now, what would stop a state bank or a public bank from doing the same?
Well, we only have one public bank, so we can use that for the model. That's the Bank of North Dakota. And they operate very honestly. And the reason is, first of all, they have no motive they're not getting bonuses, fees, commissions. They're just on a salary. And their mandate is to serve the public. So they have no motive to do exploitative things. The politicians don't have control over the bank in that sense.
Now, to my knowledge, there is no Occupy North Dakota campaign at this time. Is that your understanding?
Right. The North Dakotans are quite happy with it. I mean, the bankers themselves in North Dakota are quite happy with the Bank of North Dakota because it serves as the central bank for the state. They make cheap liquidity available for the local banks. They partner with the local banks. They do guarantee the local banks loans, and that allows the local banks to make much bigger loans and more secure loans than they would otherwise.
Right. Well, having a public bank doing utility functions in the banking sector would, of course, increase the competition in that sector, and it would create a nice, healthy, competitive economy. But America and the UK, for the most part, hate competition, and they rather have the rent-seeking and the monopoly profits of a kleptocratic class, and we're seeing the result of that. Now, on the federal level, let's talk about the Federal Reserve for a second. The idea of putting it underneath the Treasury, reporting to the Treasury, a suggestion made by Dennis Kucinich recently. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's better to nationalize the Federal Reserve than to eliminate the Federal Reserve, just because a central bank does serve many useful functions. And the biggest one is the liquidity function. The central bank is there to allow the money supply to expand. As long as we have a system where banks create our money, basically, all of our money is created by banks in the form of loans, except for coins, which are the only thing issued by the government. And the banks always want more money back than they put out there. In other words, they create the principal, but they don't create the interest necessary to pay off their loans. You have to have an expanding money supply or somebody's going to go bankrupt, which is what's happening in the EU because they don't allow their central banks to actually create money.
Well, just kind of looking at this banking model for a second, because we've talked about this before, and you've talked about the existence of paper money or fiat money is okay, given that it's very, very it's controlled. The supply of money is controlled versus, let's say, a gold standard, where that would be more or less implied. However, as you're saying here, the loans made by any bank, of course, they not only create the money to circulate in the economy, but they must also create money to pay the interest on the money that they've just created. So there's a built-in need to perpetually create money. But you're saying that if you put a cap on that money creation and very vigorously impose that cap, you can do fine with the fiat money system, correct?
I wouldn't put a cap on the money that the banks create. Banks create credit theoretically, banks create credit in response to the demand of the people for credit. So it's a very fluid, organic system. It's a good system. The only thing wrong with it is the interest, the only thing that's not mathematically sustainable. But it should be that anybody who's creditworthy can go to a bank and get a loan. And that's not true right now. Right now, the banks won't lend. Even if under the old standards, you're quite creditworthy. Businesses are all over California. That's the big complaint of small business. They cannot get the loans they used to get.
Okay, let me cut in for a second. So what about a cap on the interest rates?
When you have a public bank, the interest goes back to the public. So that is a sustainable system in the sense that you are feeding that interest back into the economy where it is available to pay principal and interest. The ideal model was in the Bank of Pennsylvania, set up in the early part of the 18th century, where the bank could they created the money in the form of paper scrip, Pennsylvania paper scrip. It would issue, say, $100 in loans at 5% interest, and then it could issue another $5 and spend that into the economy.
So let's talk about the currency for the second, using your ideas, and we see this playing out in Germany and other places. Does this mean only one currency, or can there be more than one currency, competing currencies, so to speak?
Well, I think the most efficient thing would be to have one currency. If everybody agreed on this whole system where credit was a public utility, because it's just easier to all be dealing with the same yardstick. But if you have, like the EU system right now, where the economy can't expand, the money supply can't expand, then competing currencies serve a very useful purpose. For example, I was just in Switzerland, where I went to a spa that was funded by a loan from the Veer Bank, which is a community currency, and it was a $3 million loan, and $500,000 Swiss francs worth, which is valued at more than $1, was in Veer, interest-free. This was actually a community currency, and that currency is so well accepted in Switzerland that they could actually pay workers and materials 500,000 Swiss francs in beer, and it worked out. So
Are you saying beer as in the stuff you drink?
no, it's WIR, beer. I think it's pronounced beer.
Okay. What is beer?
Beer is a community currency. It's the most longest established, well-established European community currency.
So just to follow up on the beer, tell us how it works. So there's a Swiss franc and there's a beer, right?
So the beer is counter-cyclical. In other words, when the national currency shrinks, as it has been doing lately relative to goods and services, then the local currency comes in and fills in the gap. And the local currency is issued by the Veer Bank. Now it issues both the local currency Veer and the Swiss franc. But at one time they were only issuing beer. But this spa that we went to was very elaborate. I mean, there's nothing like that in the U.S. The fact that you could get a loan from a community currency bank to do a large infrastructure project like that was quite remarkable. So, yeah, it was 0% interest on the 500,000 of Veer, and then it was 1% interest on the next million of Swiss francs, and then the rest was at 3%. So the whole thing was a very low interest loan.
Okay, well, so the Veer is a currency chosen by the people. So the people get to pick a currency. They have a plentitude of currencies to choose from. That's the market. Why not let the market decide? And this is what you're seeing in Europe, and I guess it's growing throughout Europe, Alan Brown. Is that your perception?
Yeah, well, they definitely need some alternatives there because they don't have a safety valve. We have the Federal Reserve, which can print money and does print money and expands the money supply as needed.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have. Thanks so much, Alan Brown, for being back on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Alan Brown. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.